Today's sponsor is Blue Chew, and they're giving you your first shipment totally free. All you have to do is pay $5 for shipping. Go to bluechew.com, use promo code DAVID. I've put the link right underneath this video. We've been desperately waiting for leadership from Donald Trump as the country has fallen into further disrepair and chaos, combining a 100-year pandemic with more civil unrest than we've seen in a very long time. And as I told you yesterday, Donald Trump spent the weekend tweeting from his bunker. He emerged yesterday to the Rose Garden of the White House, and instead of being conciliatory, instead of bringing down tensions, instead of doing something that we could call sensible leadership, Donald Trump went full authoritarian, saying that when governors don't handle protests the way Trump wants them to handle them, he will activate and deploy the military to states for law enforcement purposes. Here is Trump himself making the statement yesterday.
That is why I am taking immediate presidential action to stop the violence and restore security and safety in America. I am mobilizing all available federal resources, civilian and military, to stop the rioting and looting, to end the destruction and arson, and to protect the rights of law-abiding Americans, including your Second Amendment rights. Therefore, the following measures are going into effect immediately. First, we are ending the riots and lawlessness that has spread throughout our country. We will end it now. Today, I have strongly recommended to every governor to deploy the National Guard in sufficient numbers that we dominate the streets. Mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence has been quelled. If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
So there are about 100 different things to talk about here, but don't kid yourselves. This is not a rehearsal. This is the authoritarian nightmare that we've been worried about with Donald Trump for 3.5 years, that has been slowly building and escalating. And first of all, just like aside from the legality of this, which I want to talk about, there's a lot of misinformation spreading about it. This is the opposite of what we need. We have peak unrest in this country, started because law enforcement used too much force in Minneapolis on George Floyd. So Donald Trump comes out and says, hey, governors, you need to up the force used by law enforcement, or I will up it for you by deploying the military to your states. It is inconceivable. This is the worst possible thing that you could do. Second, is this legal? Now, there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation being spread about this. So let's actually go through each step, and I'll tell you where a lot of people are getting either confused or they're deliberately spreading disinformation. So in the United States, we have something called the Posse Comitatus Act or Comitatus Act. I don't know how it's pronounced. It dates back to 1878. And what this act does is it says the federal government can't use federal military personnel to enforce domestic policies. That's exactly what Donald Trump wants to do. Donald Trump wants to send federal military personnel to states to enforce local law enforcement policy. Understand that when a state deploys their National Guard, that does not violate this law. A lot of people don't necessarily make the distinction between National Guards are state units. They're administered by the state governor. And we've had, during coronavirus, we've even had National Guard deployed by governors to help with, traffic or test sites or whatever else the case may be. Perfectly legal, doesn't violate the Posse Comitatus Act. Donald Trump here is talking about deploying federal military assets to states to enforce a domestic law. And that is exactly what is prohibited by the Posse Comitatus Act. So that's step one. Now, step two, can Trump get around that? And the answer is yes, he can. And this is where a lot of the disinformation is spreading. So pay particular attention to the details here, which are that there is something called the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act can be invoked by a president, and it would give them the authority to legally deploy federal military within the United States if it is in a situation where you need to suppress civil disorder, insurrection, or rebellion. Now, this is where the misinformation is starting. You've got legal experts going on TV and saying, listen, guys, the Posse Comitatus Act is not in play because Donald Trump is planning to or is going to or can invoke the Insurrection Act at any time. This has been done a lot and it's really not a big deal. And usually they'll say, listen, just 28 years ago, it was used in 1992 in Los Angeles during the Rodney King riots. The president invoked the Insurrection Act in order to deploy the military to California. But what they're not telling you is that the usage of the Insurrection Act in 1992 was the president using it at the request of the California governor, Pete Wilson. So what we have here is Trump threatening governors saying, hey, guys, if you don't enforce what I believe needs to be enforced, I am going to fight you, go against you by using the Insurrection Act to deploy the federal military to your states. 1992 was Governor Pete Wilson saying, hey, let's invoke the Insurrection Act because things are out of control. And that was done with Executive Order 12804 by President George H.W. Bush. Of course, 92, an election year, Bill Clinton winning in November of 92, being sworn in January of 1993. What we are talking about here is a president unilaterally imposing the Insurrection Act on governors. So we can't look at 1992 because in 1992, Pete Wilson said we need to do this. This is Trump saying, not I'm working with the governors to do this. It's I'm going to punish the governors. I'm going to fight the governors with the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act of 1807 has not been used unilaterally in 57 years. And it has never been used in the way Trump wants to use it, which is essentially to override local discretion regarding how to manage the unrest that is currently going on. When you look at some of the previous uses of the Insurrection Act against a governor's wishes, they were done against racism. Okay, so understand the insanity of what we have. What we look at in the past would be Lincoln in 1861, right? We had the Civil War to fight slavery. Eisenhower in 57 in Arkansas to fight state racism. Kennedy in 1962 in Mississippi. Kennedy in 1963 in Alabama. So when in the past a president has invoked the Insurrection Act, not in concert with governors, but against them, it has been to fight racism. We could not be further from that in what Donald Trump is trying to do here. Now, if Trump tries to do it, it could become a legal fight. But this is all part of the continued distractathon. I tweeted last night that Trump's strategy here on the protests, ironically, this is not like a Russia thing, but ironically, Trump's strategy is CCCP. And I'll tell you what that stands for. Confuse about what's actually happening in our country. That's number one. Number two, conflate protesters versus looters versus rioters versus inciters. Criticize everybody, right? So governors, Democrats, protesters. And then lastly, CCCP, the P is pander to his Trumpist base, much of which loves authoritarianism, also pandering to his base by going and staging a propaganda picture of himself holding a Bible in front of St. John's Cathedral after yesterday's Rose Garden statement. And that's what I want to talk about next. So we are in a full dystopia at this point in time. Yesterday, I already told you, Donald Trump went to the Rose Garden. He gave an authoritarian nightmare of a speech where he says he will fight governors by deploying the military to enforce the law in their states. The legal fight is Posse Comitatus Act versus Insurrection Act. We've already talked about that. Certainly at its face, the idea that we need to fight protests about law enforcement using too much force by scaling up the amount of force used by law enforcement, that's crazy. We've already talked about that. But then we get into the propaganda of this. Donald Trump had protesters tear-gassed and dispersed with horses to clear the way for Donald Trump to walk to St. John's Church in Washington, D.C., and be photographed holding up a Bible. He was asked, Mr. President, is that your Bible? And he said, it is a Bible. Of course, it's not Trump's Bible. Trump is not religious. This is merely pandering. In front of the church, this was done in a completely just sickening, obvious, brazen attempt to propagandize. But in order to get over there, here is video of the protesters. And here you will hear the bangs going off. You will see the gas start to rise. Hey, he takes the propaganda seriously for sure. Here are members of the press being shooed away as Donald Trump walks over to the cathedral.
Press, let's go. Press, let's go. Come on. Guys, we gotta go. To the right, move. To the right.
And then here's an overhead view of the entire crowd being aggressively dispersed, including with tear gas, because the leader, Trump, must get to the church to hold someone's Bible, bringing out the horses. You're going to hear some of the flashbangs at the start of this video. And so then here is Donald Trump calling over his press secretary and a couple of others and standing there. And sort of at some point, Trump says, OK, the propaganda event is over. And this is one of the most awkward video clips I've seen in a long time.
We have the greatest country in the world. Thank you very much, everybody. We're going to keep it nice and safe.
So everybody there in that photo op, people who should be unemployed come January if we do our job in November. Now, by the way, just one other thing from earlier. Here was Trump's Rose Garden statement just minutes before walking over to St. John's, having protesters tear gassed and dispersed with horses. You can hear explosions going on in the background while Trump is speaking.
He will not have died in vain, but we cannot allow the righteous cries of peaceful protesters to be drowned out by an angry mob, the biggest victims of the riot.
That is not thunder you are hearing, my friends. Those are flashbangs going off to disperse protesters in advance of Trump walking over to St. John's Cathedral. This is where we are. It's incredible how far we have fallen since that horrible day in November of 2016. And I've been talking about hyper-normalization. I've been talking about desensitization. It happens a little bit at a time. But now when you go back and think of that day when Donald Trump was inaugurated, we have fallen so far. Now, if you need a reminder of how not religious Trump is, if you needed a reminder of how the Bible and the church are just props for the president, remember this video from the campaign where Donald Trump making it abundantly clear he doesn't know a damn thing about the Bible. He doesn't care about the Bible.
Okay. You mentioned the Bible. You've been talking about how it's your favorite book. And you said, I think last night in Iowa, some people are surprised that you say that. I'm wondering what one or two of your most favored Bible verses are and why.
I wouldn't want to get into it because to me that's very personal. You know, when I talk about the Bible, it's very personal. So I don't want to get into verses. I don't want to get into...
There's no verse that means a lot to you that you think about or cite?
The Bible means a lot to me, but I don't want to get into specifics.
Even to cite a verse that
you
like?
No, I don't want to do that.
You're an Old Testament guy or a New Testament guy?
Probably equal. I think it's just an incredible... The whole Bible is an incredible... I joke very much so. They always hold up the Art of the Deal. I say my second favorite book of all time. But I just think the Bible is just something very special.
This has to stop. This has to stop for our sake. It has to stop for the world's sake. It has to stop for our future's sake. Trump doesn't even attend church. It's not even his Bible. Aggressively and violently dispersing peaceful protesters with horses and flashbangs and tear gas so that he could hold up someone's Bible and take advantage of just a disgusting, I mean, this is like Soviet style, North Korea style propaganda that Donald Trump is brazenly crafting in front of our very eyes. And we have to end it. We have to end it. Let me know your thoughts about all of this. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman. Thrilled to see more and more folks listening to the daily audio podcast of the show. If you watch on YouTube, you may not know that you can go on iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play Podcasts, whatever you want, and get our daily audio podcast. Do it. It's a great way to consume the show in addition to the YouTube clips. Let me know your thoughts about this propaganda on Twitter at @dpacman, and we'll be right back.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
This episode was sponsored by Blue Chew, giving my viewers their first shipment totally free when you go to bluechew.com and use promo code DAVID. It's just a reality that many men, regardless of age, can sometimes benefit from a boost in confidence, a little bit of performance help. Blue Chew is the first chewable tablet with the same FDA-approved ingredients as Viagra and Cialis. Blue Chew being a chewable tablet means it starts working twice as fast as a pill. It's prescribed online. You spend a couple minutes with a short questionnaire. A licensed doctor reviews the information, decides if a prescription is right for you. It's then shipped directly to your home in discreet packaging. No awkward visits to the doctor's office or pharmacy. Plus, it's also cheaper than getting it at a pharmacy. When you go to bluechew.com and use promo code DAVID, you will get your first shipment completely free. Just pay $5 shipping. That's promo code DAVID to get your first shipment of Blue Chew completely free. And I've put the link right underneath this video.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
All right, we have so much to get to today that I will take no more than 15 seconds just to say thanks to David Samuels and Nicholas Guzman, today's new David Pakman Show members of the day, and a big thank you to Michael Montanara, who is today's long-term sustaining member. He's been a member for 5 years. Support the show at joinpakman.com with a membership. Okay, we have leaked audio of an absolute madman rant by the president. This happened during a call that Donald Trump had yesterday with governors from around the country. The calls were about the protests. The calls were in advance of Donald Trump going out into the Rose Garden and saying, if you don't scale up force, I will do it for you by sending the military to your states. These are, simply put, the rantings of an agitated, lunatic authoritarian who sounds very desperate, who sounds very scared, and realizes he is quickly losing control that he probably never even really had. Let's take a listen to it. The context is totally impotent Trump, who was tweeting insults and threats all weekend from the White House while adults actually tried to figure out what to do. So first of all, Donald Trump says here, I guess that he's saying that the Minneapolis police are a laughingstock. Take a listen.
What happened in the state of Minnesota, they were a laughingstock all over the world. They took over the police department. The police were running down the street, sirens blazing, the rest of them running. It was on camera. And then they wiped out. You probably have to build a new one, but I've never seen anything like it. And the whole world was laughing. 3 days later, I spoke to the governor. The governor's, I think, on the call, and he's an excellent guy. And all of a sudden, and I said, you got to use the National Guard in big numbers. They did it first, then they did. And I'll tell you that, I don't know what it was. It was, Governor, it was the third night. What night? Those guys walked through that stuff like it was butter.
So there is Trump bragging about when the police became more militarized, they started carving through crowds of protesters like butter. Just disgusting language. And for Trump, this is all sport. It's all visual. It's what is Fox News showing when Trump turns on the channel. Let's continue. It only gets worse from here, unfortunately.
They walked right through, and you haven't had any problems since. I mean, they don't. They're not going to go there now. They'll go to some other place. But once you called out and you dominated. You took the worst place and you made it. They didn't even cover it last night because there was so little action.
So here's Donald Trump again making the case that police forces need to be militarized. This is part of the problem in the United States. Understand that we have a situation here where we have protests and unrest, which were catalyzed by police using too much force and killing George Floyd. And Trump is demanding that law enforcement use even more force. It could not possibly be more backwards. Then here is Trump again continuing in this leaked audio of a call with governors using the language of the domination of protesters. Take a look.
Because you dominated. You dominated. Now, what happened to New York, I have to tell you, I live in Manhattan. What's going on in Manhattan, I have no idea. New York's finest, they got to be allowed maybe to do their jobs. I don't know what's happening in Manhattan, but it's terrible. And because it's New York, because it's Manhattan, it gets a lot of press. So they really spend a lot of time on it. But New York has got to have to toughen up. And we'll send you National Guard if you want. You have the largest police force in the country, 40,000 people, I understand. But what's going on in New York is terrible. It's terrible. Of all the places. What went on last night in Los Angeles with the stores and the storefronts is terrible. No domination. You have to dominate. You have to dominate.
Again, the police forces must toughen up. We'll send soldiers. You have to dominate the protesters. Trump reportedly angry throughout the entire call. Trump said leaders should be seeking retribution. This is the language of a mob boss. This is not the language of a president of the United States faced with unrest, the likes of which we've not seen for a long time. Trump told governors, you don't have to be too careful. In other words, don't be too careful. Do the opposite of being careful. Trump does not know how to lead. He simply does not have, listen, he doesn't have the cognitive capacity to deal with the complexity of this situation. We have to concede that. And his view is this over-aggressive view of let's dominate the protesters. He seems afraid, not literally of the protesters, but of what this could do to his presidency. But it is just not within him to lead. He doesn't have any tools. As I said yesterday, and a lot of people wrote to me and said, David, this felt like the right metaphor or analogy, and I didn't come up with it. If you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And that is exactly the situation we have. Trump has very few tools. And he doesn't have a velvet glove the way he himself once analogized. He has a couple of different size hammers. And so everything looks like a nail to him. His tools are shaming people, insulting people, making threats. That's what he's doing here, even though it's absolutely the last thing that we need. So we have to realize at this point many things, but I'll focus on two important realizations that we need to come to. And I know many of you have probably come to these realizations already. Number one, we aren't going to get anything but more of this from Donald Trump, period. No matter the circumstances, no matter what is necessary, no matter what is called for, these are his routines, and this is all he can really do. Staged photo ops at the church that we talked about earlier, military deployments, saying governors, you better get it together. You guys are jerks or incompetent or whatever else. That's all we are going to get from Trump. Number two, there is a possibility that Trump actually sees more chaos as good for him, especially if he can frame it as this is merely the left doing bad things, which they've started to do yesterday. Yesterday, I covered live Trump's press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, did a press briefing, and she must have talked about Antifa, a dozen times, 24 times. And this is a calculated strategy. They talk about Antifa to dismiss and disqualify the overwhelmingly peaceful protesters, the actual issues that launched these protests. Now, I don't know if it will work. This may be a miscalculation by Donald Trump, or it may work. If the virus continues, if the chaos continues, if the country continues to see no leadership from Donald Trump, and meanwhile, Joe Biden keeps meeting with protesters and staking out a position on police treatment of minorities that addresses the systemic problems. This doesn't mean Joe Biden is a hero. This means nothing other than on this issue right now, right? You can talk about Biden in 94. Right now, Joe Biden is showing more leadership and understanding of this issue than is Donald Trump. I don't know that Trump is going to come away from this unscathed or with an increased approval rating, because it doesn't look like he's doing anything right. Now, there's a new national poll out from ABC from over the weekend, which has Joe Biden at plus 10 points nationally against Donald Trump. This is an unconscionable number. This is on the high end. Polls are generally showing Biden leading by between 4 and 11 nationally. So certainly 10 is on the high end. But what is it that will come from what Trump is doing that will close the gap with Biden? Whether you believe the gap is 4 or 10 or 7, what is it that Trump is doing that will close the gap? It's hard to imagine. His supporters will be with him no matter what, but consider the backwards nature of Trump's reaction. And this is what I keep going back to. The protests were started by the brutal handling of a black man by Minnesota police. So what does Trump do? He says, you governors need to be more aggressive, and I will send federal military to be more aggressive if you don't do it. I don't know that this will work. I hope that it doesn't work, because it's absolutely horrifying. Let's talk a little bit about the fact that we still have a 100-year global pandemic going on in the United States, and many states are improving while many states are worsening in terms of the spread. We will see what effect the protests have on spread of the virus. It'll take about 10 days to know for sure. But I wanted to let you guys know something that maybe will not surprise some of you, which is that Dr. Anthony Fauci has now confirmed that Donald Trump no longer speaks to him very much, and that he doesn't speak to really any of the doctors on the coronavirus task force. Now, why wouldn't this surprise you? Well, if you know Trump, it wouldn't surprise you. But 5 or 6 weeks ago, I came to you and I said, Donald Trump is now transitioning to, we are no longer going to talk about coronavirus as a medical event. We are no longer talking about coronavirus as a medical problem. We're going to shift to, we being Trump, we're going to shift to roundtables with CEOs about how much we're reopening and how many loans we've dispersed and yada, yada, yada. Dr. Anthony Fauci on the coronavirus task force is the top infectious disease doctor in the United States. And we as a country started to see less and less of him weeks ago. Dr. Fauci now has done a number of interviews recently. And in one interview with Stat News, said something incredibly revealing, but not altogether shocking. Dr. Fauci was asked, does the president talk to you about the vaccine work often? And Fauci's answer was no. We used to have task force meetings every single day, including Saturday and Sunday. And about 75% of the time after the task force meeting, we would meet with the president. So I was meeting with him 4 times a week back a month or so ago. But as you probably noticed, that the task force meetings have not occurred as often lately. And certainly my meetings with the president have been dramatically decreased. Now, there are going to be right-wingers and Trumpists who say, this makes sense. This makes sense. The problem is going away, the problem being coronavirus. So, of course, you have fewer meetings. The problem is that that's not based in reality. Look at the trend lines in the United States. Cases and deaths have slowly declined over a 10-week period, but we are often still finding 20,000, 22,000 new cases in a single day. In terms of deaths, fortunately, the trend line is down, but we still regularly have 1,500 deaths in a single day from coronavirus. So nothing is over. This may end up merely being a warm-up for wave 2 in the fall, which could be even worse. It could be not as bad. We don't know. We might not really even have a break between the 2 waves. And indeed, it seemed like the breaking point for Donald Trump was that just disastrous, shameful press briefing in April, where Trump wondered aloud about injecting bleach and rubbing alcohol into the body. And the coronavirus press briefings were already starting to wane then. And now it's over. And Dr. Fauci has barely any contact with Donald Trump. Now, there's some aspect of, if I don't look at it, if I don't talk about it, it doesn't exist. It's like a hear no evil, see no evil sort of thing. This is kind of a weird direction to go, but there's something called object permanence, and child development people will know about this already. And this is a big milestone for little kids. As babies develop, there's a phase where if you take a ball and you hide it, the baby doesn't know that the ball continues to exist, even if you've hidden it behind your back. And at some point, I can't believe this is how we're analyzing a president. At some point in child development, developing children realize, even if I can no longer see the ball still exists. They can hold the idea of the ball in their mind, and they continue to understand that just because you don't see the ball doesn't mean it has disappeared from existence. Trump's strategy is like that of a baby pre-development of object permanence. I won't talk about it. I won't look at it. It's like it doesn't exist. And Trump had this idea pretty early on. Remember, with testing, Trump knew early on, if we do more testing, we're going to find more cases. Let's keep our case numbers low by not doing a lot of testing. That, of course, backfired. So then we get to a separate question, which is, does Trump even believe experts who come to him with information that he admittedly doesn't even want to be given? Not really. Donald Trump believes he knows more than his generals and his doctors and more than anybody. So the benefit to meeting with the experts is limited by the fact that Trump thinks he knows more than them anyway. But regardless, Dr. Anthony Fauci no longer getting much FaceTime with Donald Trump. Not a big surprise. I would love it if Dr. Fauci did regular briefings himself. I wouldn't even be opposed to the CDC being part of them, like Dr. Redfield. I know he's kind of a Trump tool, but without Trump hovering in the background, hinged forward at the hips and swiveling, as he often does during the briefings, I think Dr. Fauci and Dr. Redfield together could give us a lot of really valuable information. Birx, remains a question mark in terms of her just blind loyalty to Donald Trump. But it would be great to do it like other countries do it. Get the politicians out. Let's get a briefing from medical experts, period. We're not getting that either, unfortunately. Follow The David Pakman Show on Instagram at David Pakman Show for continued coverage of all of today's stories. And while you are there, follow my personal Instagram. Not very political. Many elements of recreation and gardening on my personal Instagram. Maybe a good respite from consistently horrible news that we are facing today. I am David.Pakman on Instagram.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The David Pakman Show depends on your support, and the easiest way is through membership, which includes the world-famous bonus show, as well as commercial-free audio and video streams of the show just for members. Sign up today at joinpakman.com. Coupon code saves you 40%. Vote soon 18.
Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today Jonathan Haber, who's the author of the new book, Critical Thinking from MIT Press. Also, the guy behind logiccheck.net, a website that checks not just the facts, but also the reasoning behind the news of the day. It's so great to have you on, Jonathan.
Great to be on, David.
So what is the sort of origin of critical thinking as a discipline? Does it come from some of those philosophers that many of us were introduced to in freshman year of college? Is it older than that?
Well, it definitely draws on those ancient disciplines, certainly philosophy, particularly Western philosophy, the work of Aristotle, but also more modern disciplines such as science, particularly some of the early science that was a discourse between, philosophers and sort of proto-scientists, psychology more recently, and then most recently, cognitive science. So actually, critical thinking itself, the concept that there is a form of thinking unique enough to be called critical, distinct from intelligence and wisdom, is actually a 20th century concept.
We've seen, what a media literacy class can look like, teaching one to critically analyze media messages, critical thinking, epistemology. There's a lot of material on the internet. Is the reason that a lot of this material is necessary that these are not concepts that we intuitively learn, in the sense that at some point, a baby realizes that the circle is not going to fit into the rectangular peg, or the triangular peg or whatever, and it's an intuitive lesson? Are the critical thinking skills that you espouse and talk about in the book, are they not something humans intuitively pick up?
Well, they're definitely not. Our intuitions actually need to be disciplined.
which is why you need to structure your thinking in order to reason. I think, science is a good example where people have not historically always thought scientifically. That was something that was constructed and over centuries, really. The discipline of thinking scientifically of developed into a norm. I think critical thinking is much more broad than that. It's something that you could apply not just to science, but to every subject. But it's not something that comes intuitively, nor is it taught. I mean, it used to be, going back to Roman times, logic, rhetoric, those were the cornerstones of the educational curriculum right through modernity. But in modern times, we, of course, have many more things to learn: modern science, history, cultures, language, which is great. But I think that meant that logic, rhetoric, some of the critical thinking kind of core foundational skills have been crowded out in favor of new knowledge. And I think that's one of the reasons we both lack the intuition, but we're not taught this in schools.
Are we currently sort of at a bad moment when it comes to critical thinking skills in the population at large? I mean, I know we've been tracking anti-intellectual movements certainly for a couple hundred years with a pretty significant degree of specificity, but is there some sort of like peak that we are now experiencing, or dearth maybe is the right word?
I think there's not been some golden age where everybody thought critically and we've sort of fallen off since then. I mean, this has always been a set of skills that some people take on, some people don't, some people may be more naturally inclined towards thinking reasonably than others. Or you have, what's very typical is people will think critically about subjects like their jobs, right? They'll make decisions about, you're a carpenter, how to cut a piece of wood. You're a computer programmer. You can think very logically when you're writing code, but we will not apply it to things like political decisions, whom to vote for, or even sort of interpersonal decisions. So I think probably what makes this period more nerve-wracking is that there are all kinds of ways to support thinking poorly. If critical thinking is kind of thinking well, there are less productive ways of thinking. You can believe whatever you already believe, confirmation bias. You could believe whatever you're told, right? Just believe authority figures. And I think now that we have a new media landscape, particularly with social media, that allows us to isolate ourselves into bubbles where we don't really even have to listen to anybody we disagree with. I think a lot of the sort of toxic politics and miscommunication we have is a result of, not so much that people aren't internalizing the rules of critical thinking. I think just there's more sources of bad premises, I guess, around.
What is the mechanism that is most effective at disarming one's critical thinking faculties? I mean, you sort of alluded in a way, personal life things and political things, as opposed to how a woodworker may best cut a piece of wood. Is it sort of having a personal stake, which blinds us maybe to applying the same type of critical thinking we otherwise would?
Well, I think that there's, critical thinking skills. You had your YouTube channel where you cover many of the logical skills that are vital to critical thinking. That's what's covered in a lot of critical thinking courses you might take in college. And there's a lot of material on the internet on logic and fallacies and those sorts of things. So that's the sort of knowledge you need. But then you need the skills to use that knowledge. In other words, if we're talking about logic for this example, you need to put those skills to use, put logical principles to use a lot in lots of situations, in your work, in your school, in your life. And you need to sort of favor thinking reasonably, thinking logically over other forms of reasoning, such as just believing what you've already believed. But then there's a whole group of dispositions. You have to want to apply logic to things that might make you uncomfortable, like examining your own beliefs, for example. And I think that without all three pieces, without the knowledge, the skills, and the dispositions, you can't really think of yourself as a critical thinker. So I'd say situations where people, are very skilled thinkers in certain parts of their life, but turn off reason when it comes to other factors, that's a form of sort of not thinking critically in terms of not exercising proper critical thinking dispositions.
Yeah, so you can't teach someone to want to examine their own beliefs, right? I mean, so You could maybe encourage someone, but it's not a teachable skill in the same way that identifying fallacies would be.
I think it's not teachable, except that you can learn about the sort of flaws in the human makeup that are non-cognitive, right? Some of them are, we could be led by emotions or instincts, right? Those can overwhelm reason. And also, there's cognitive biases. There's been a whole cottage industry of people writing about confirmation bias and anchoring bias and all these various sort of, flaws in our reasoning. So I think you can learn about the human mind's makeup and understand that we are all susceptible to flawed thinking, and therefore we shouldn't assume we're always right. But I think in terms of dispositions, that would fall in the category of kind of morals education, that these are intellectual virtues, right? Open-mindedness, faith in reason, intellectual humility. And I think you can learn those the same way you learn other moral principles by example. For example, if your household, if these sort of intellectual virtues are practiced, then you'll tend to likely internalize them. If you live in a household with dogmatic politics, for example, or a place where fundamental beliefs are never questioned, then you will learn that, right? You'll learn not to question beliefs. So I think that they can be learned. It's sort of like behaviors, any sort of ethical behavior, you learn them over time.
When it comes to make this really concrete, given the subject matter of this program, when it comes to political messages and material that we get through corporate media and mass media, what would you say are the one or two sort of lowest hanging fruit in terms of the principles that, if more frequently applied, would lead to far more informed people? So like one that I might look at would be just understanding correlation versus causation, right? Mm-hmm. With coronavirus, people who get really sick tend to have lower vitamin D levels. Is that a causation or is that a correlation explained by something else? The economy did well after something happened with taxes. Did it do well because of that, or are they both impact, right? So that would be one that I would maybe consider, but I'm curious what you would think about as the most important, lowest hanging fruit that would most help consumers of political news.
Well, I think, correlation versus causation, much like the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning and many of the topics that kind of go into being a critical thinker, those are all vital. And I think the good news is one can learn what they are and how to use them relatively quickly. I mean, I think your videos were 3 to 5 minutes on each of these topics. I did a program called Critical Voter that sort of taught much of the same material. I was surprised how easy it is to learn those things. So I think certainly, the 3 things I would recommend is one, learn those things because it doesn't take that much time. But I think, if you want the low-hanging fruit, the things to do would be one, to practice them, to use them as much as possible. Critical thinking is really a skill. It's kind of like playing the piano or being good at a sport, right? The more you do it, the better you get. There's one researcher who thinks critical thinking is like, a sport or an instrument. It takes 10,000 hours to get really good at it. So I'd say because the knowledge and the techniques are relatively easy to pick up, it's just a question of how much you dedicate to practicing them. And then I guess the other piece I'd say the lowest hanging fruit, even though it might be the most difficult, is charitability, being charitable to opinions, especially those you don't agree with. I think show you did last week, you referred to steel manning an argument, which as opposed to straw manning an argument. And that's really a reflection of the principle of charity, right? You should try to address the strongest version of an opponent's argument rather than attacking one flaw in it or coming up with a weak version or a parody. And that's relatively easy to do when it's your own arguments you're looking to sort of strengthen. I think the hardest part is to treat opposing arguments, treating arguments from people who you fundamentally disagree with in a charitable fashion. But I think a lot of intellectual virtues kind of derive from that spirit of charity.
In the limited time we have, is there one specific example that you've seen be one of the most difficult beliefs or areas of subject matter for people to really think critically about?
Well, the 2 big ones are obviously politics and religion, right? Because these both are fundamentally about our identity. And I think certainly as religions sort of fades as a foundation of our identity. Our sort of political identities take on many qualities that were once sort of you'd see in religious-based conflicts, kind of the level of heatedness. So I would say, the understanding that any argument based on somebody's identity is going to be treated very sensitively, right? Because nobody ever changed their mind about a belief fundamental to their identity because they lost an argument, right? Nobody changed their mind because they lost an argument on Twitter, for example, but even sort of lost, a more civilized argument, right? That might crack the ice. That might sort of get you thinking, oh, maybe there's some things I don't know, or maybe some of the things I believe I should question. But changing your mind, changing beliefs about something that's very, very personal to you is something that leaves you very vulnerable. So I think if we want to change the minds of others, which obviously, your program and other media programs like it are looking to do, you should sort of do what you can to empathize with those you disagree with, try to get into their heads, try to understand what they're thinking. And an exercise I often challenge people on is, think about what argument would get you to change your mind about something that you strongly believe in. And that'll get you to sort of understand the difficulty of such a situation. And once you can appreciate it, then I think you might be in a better position to address opponents or address people who you disagree with in a more empathetic and I think ultimately potentially more successful way.
The book is Critical Thinking. We've been speaking with the author Jonathan Haber, whose work you can also find at logiccheck.net. Jonathan, really appreciate your time, and it's been a pleasure having you.
Oh, thank you, and thanks for all your work as well.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The David Pakman Show depends on the support of our viewers and listeners, and one way to keep us going is through Patreon, where you can pledge as little as $1 per month or as much as you want at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Great perks and benefits as well. Read about them.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, this is not the most important aspect of the current situation that we're in. I understand that, but I do believe it's worth mentioning because there's a very important media component to what is going on in our country right now, not only with the protests and the unrest and George Floyd, but also with coronavirus. This happened early with coronavirus, and it is now happening with all content related to George Floyd, protests, police brutality, Antifa, and even Trump's comments about these things. YouTube and Facebook have completely demonetized all of this content. If you talk about one of the most important issues facing our country right now, YouTube and Facebook will demonetize your videos. Now, I want to be really clear. This is not me crying censorship. This is not me saying YouTube and Facebook are doing something illegal. This is me explaining to you how they are making the wrong decision, and this is how the soft suppression using demonetization of newsworthy, independent reporting happens. Now, I can talk about the fact that our country is burning down as relations between citizens and law enforcement completely break down. I can talk about the fact that we have 3 officers still not charged who were standing there watching a 4th officer kill George Floyd. I can talk about how our president is failing to lead and egging on police violence, but we won't make any money from that. And I'll have to figure out a different way to pay staff and to do everything that we do. And believe me, I'm going to keep talking about it because you need to know what's going on, and we can't leave it simply to corporatist voices to tell you what it is that's going on. But this is very ugly. It is tragic, in fact. Yesterday, we did a ton of coverage, of course, of George Floyd, the protests, and tangentially related topics, all demonetized on both YouTube and Facebook. Check this out. This is how important reporting gets suppressed. So, okay, protests erupt and society breaks down. That was a 15-minute segment. I got a lot of compliments about it, spent all weekend researching how I wanted to approach this. Demonetized, yellow $sign, as you can see on YouTube, also demonetized on Facebook. Trump threatening protesters with dogs. This is a scandal. Sorry, demonetized on YouTube and Facebook. Police, victims or oppressors, hugely important story. Nearly 10 minutes about how should police departments and officers deal with what's going on? Is staying silent making one a part of the problem? This is a paramount issue. Demonetized. Trump says he will designate Antifa a terrorist group. This is a president misusing the State Department's foreign terrorist organization list to suppress American citizens' due process and First Amendment. It's a distraction from the real issues. It's a totalitarian scandal. Sorry, David, demonetized. And then, of course, our full hour show, the full hour show, which contains these stories, also demonetized. What are we doing, guys? What is the point of all this? What's the point of putting in the work? And, you know, it's a really clever and great way to virtue signal, to say, we want people dealing with important issues. We don't want clickbait. We don't want low effort content. Well, we spent all weekend researching this stuff, violent and nonviolent protest, destruction of property as a form of protest historically, the 6 or 7 different components to the protest. I mean, you know, we're talking about a ton of staff time, and it's just like, nah. Sorry, our country's burning, but if you want to monetize, what about a Kardashian lying about being a billionaire? Maybe talk about that if you want to monetize. YouTube says we want to be part of the solutions, conversations, we want to support creators. Facebook, supposedly the same thing. But if you even tangentially touch the biggest news story along with coronavirus, then no ads are going to play. You might remember this happened at the start of coronavirus as well. We were early on coronavirus. We were covering it early, despite not only the fact that a lot of people thought it was overblown then, but despite the monetization, and we kept doing it. After like a month, YouTube realized this coronavirus thing might go on for a while. We can't just demonetize everything, and they started to monetize it. This is how you nudge channels so that they'll opt to cover, you know, some BS. And more of the coverage of what's going on in this country, the social unrest, ends up being corporate media, and independent channels get pushed away from it. So we're not backing off. Today's show also, I mean, the entire show is likely to be demonetized. Maybe there's 1 or 2 stories that won't be. We are not going to back off talking about it. We have a crisis. The crisis is that Trump's leadership has failed. We have major conflict when it comes to law enforcement. All of it needs to be discussed, but this is how YouTube and Facebook are dealing with it. So know that if you want, if you're able, you can support our work directly. You know, only about 0.5% of our audience has memberships, but you can grab a membership at joinpacman.com. If we can get from 0.5% to 1% of our audience supporting us, it's game over, right? I mean, none of this stuff matters. None of the demonetization matters. So consider grabbing a membership at joinpacman.com. You can get a 66% discount with the code This Is 2020. Don't feel obligated to use the discount. Don't feel obligated to get a membership at all. We're going to continue covering this stuff because it matters. And it is once again tragic that this is how some of the major platforms where we get, you know, millions and tens of millions of views a month between YouTube and Facebook, that this is the approach that they are taking. It's sick. We can fight it. And, you know, even if you don't support me, support some other show. If you think some other show is doing better coverage of this, by all means, support them. But we have to make sure that independent voices don't get sort of softly nudged away from talking about this stuff, because then it leaves just the corporate media outlets talking about it. We can't allow that to happen. Here is something I want to address that has come up quite a bit because of what we're experiencing right now since the killing of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin. There are people on the left and on the right who will sometimes try to tout their non-racist bona fides by using some version of the phrase, I don't see color. Now, different people will use that phrase to mean different things. There are people who will sometimes use the phrase, I don't see color, when they're called out about some policy that will like disproportionately affect minorities. They'll say, I don't see color. I'm just talking about policy. Sometimes you will see people say, I don't see color in the sense that they say they are colorblind in their political views. This is a very dumb phrase, and I would suggest that it not be used anymore. And I want to be clear that I understand what people often mean when they say I don't see color. And I'm going to give you a better way to talk about it that's more credible. Because I don't see color doesn't really make any sense, because all of the science tells us we very much see color. We just do. Doesn't mean we're racist. It doesn't mean we discriminate. But the instant that we meet people, whether it's Western individuals in developed countries or remote tribes in the Amazon or the Australian outback, we almost instantly are assessing and assimilating what we believe to be the gender of the person we are talking to, the age of the person we are talking to, and the race of the person we are talking to the extent that you can discern that from looking at them. The instant I walk up to a cashier at my grocery store, I am instantly making an assessment of, I'm speaking to a roughly 30-year-old Hispanic female, for example. We all see color, and we all are instantly assessing it because it's just part of being human and living in a society. Is there any situation in which someone could come up to you and say, hey, remember the gardener that came to the house last week? Do you remember if they were male or female? No, I have no recollection of it. Of course you do. Of course you do. Was the nurse that did your COVID test, was it like a 20-something nurse or was it like a 60-something-year-old nurse? I don't remember. Was your bank teller yesterday white, black, Asian, or Hispanic? I have no idea. We all know it, unless, barring some kind of memory or cognitive issue. So when I hear people say things like, I don't see color in my interactions with the world, people are just people, give me a break. You do. You see gender and you see age, and we are immediately assessing race and color as well. We all see each other. We recognize how someone might look similar or different from us, and that is okay. What might actually be accurate to say, and where I think the focus should be, is I don't judge people on the basis of their appearance, which includes race. That might be accurate. Now, a lot of us still have implicit and preconceived notions about people on the basis of these characteristics. In many cases, they're relatively benign, and that's fine. Sometimes they are discriminatory. But I actually want to go even further. Imagine that it were true. We don't notice people's race. We really don't see color. If that were to be the case, it would immediately dismiss the reality that there are racial injustices even today in society. If I didn't see color, if someone said to me, hey, can you snap your fingers? And you could snap your fingers and become black right now in society. Would you want to do it? If I didn't see color, I'd have no way to answer that question. Now, of course I see color, and of course I recognize that I would likely be worse off in society if I were black than being white Hispanic as I am and passing as white. I see color, and that allows me to recognize that if someone says, you could snap a finger and be black, do you want to do it? No, I'd be worse off in society if I did that. I recognize that in part because I see color. We also all see color, by the way, by virtue of seeing how different people are treated in society by different institutions. And we're, of course, seeing that very much with the George Floyd situation. So I think that just about covers it. I find the phrase, I don't see color, to be pretty silly, quite frankly. And for people who are trying to make the case that they're not making judgments about others on the basis of race, that I like. It may be true, it may not be true. It's certainly something to aspire to. But let's be more accurate when we talk about it. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. I'm playing this voicemail for two reasons. Number one, as I mentioned earlier in the show, all of our protest and George Floyd coverage is being demonetized on YouTube and Facebook. So the fact that someone called in and actually praised our coverage really means a lot. And number two, it has been really heartwarming to see the number of people reaching out to me and saying, David, I really appreciate your coverage of the protest. You're not creating these false black-white hot takes. You're actually dealing with the complex nature of what's going on. Here's one voicemail caller who made a similar point.
David, one of the reasons why I'm happy to be a subscriber of yours is that you're probably the best progressive commentator out there. You're not delusional. you're not crazy, and you honestly try to report the news from an honest and fact-based perspective. And thanks for covering the George Floyd story very well and pointing out that this is a story of many stories and not just one thing that you need to focus on. There's so many problems in this country that this is revealing. Thanks for being a good reporter.
I so appreciate that, and thanks to everybody who has been writing in about our coverage. We've got a great bonus show for you today. Don't miss it. Get a membership at joinpacman.com to get instant access to the bonus show. I will see you then. Thanks so much for watching today's episode. Just a reminder, today's sponsor, Blue Chew, is giving you your first shipment completely free. All you have to do is pay $5 shipping. Go to bluechew.com and use the promo code DAVID. I've put a link right underneath this video.